So, hello everybody. Oh wow, why don't we have a full room? It's PCI, right? It's a subject dear to everybody, right? I guess maybe it's the conference. Okay, in any case, today we're going to talk about PCI done right and wrong. We're going to have a bunch of stories from our experience about how people have dealt with PCI, and we're going to deal with both merchant side, QSA side, and a bunch of other stories from the whole realm. Some introduction to PCI, which we would focus on security crowd. It's not an introduction for merchants who are selling gas. We're going to talk about some peculiarities of PCI to people who know security. PCI done right and wrong would have a bunch of attitudes, views, stories, approaches to PCI, which we've seen in the real world, and how some of them are completely wrong and cause all sorts of painful mayhem, and some of them are right and create, well, what do they create? Harmony?
I don't know about harmony.
Well, okay, there we go. Not harmony. Maybe happiness. How about happiness?
Yeah. We're going to do this feedback.
Branden, want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Branden Williams. I'm currently the director of the security consulting practice at RSA. I've been doing PCI for a long time. When I started doing it, it was called KISP and SDP. It was revision 2.3 and 2.4 are the ones that I worked on in the KISP world back in 2004. Find me on Twitter. We've got a blog. We've got the book. We're actually going to be giving one away here this session, and there's a book signing after the session. So if you have one, come by and talk to us.
And it's actually, as far as the book, we wouldn't be selling the book too much, but you have to do it a little bit to make our publisher happy.
Right.
They're not here. Okay. In any case, it's a book which is useful not just to merchants, but it has stories. Branden had a whole bunch of case studies, which are so much fun that the book is worth its price just for the case studies. And they're all anonymous, and there's no way to know. Okay, there we go. I'll shut up. So, my name is Anton Churkin. I am Branden's co-author for the book. You can find me in many places, so I'm not going to talk too much about myself. I do it already way too much. Okay, so this picture is basically the very vanilla view on PCI. And while I am using this, there are a couple of interesting things about PCI. When people say PCI, PCI, they argue with that, they support it, they like it. They usually mean one of two things, actually. They either mean the guidance, the actual PCI DSS document, or they mean PCI as a regulatory regime. QSAs, ASVs, assessment, self-assessment. So sometimes when people vent about PCI, they have no beef with the standard itself. They have the beef with the authorities, with other things. And you know what? There's PCI Council, of course, but the real authority is right in the center of the picture, which is the card brands. And that's I don't know what's the hidden truth of PCI. That's more of an open truth of PCI, that the brands are the original power behind the standard and behind the regime. I mean, sometimes it's kind of funny when people say, that when vendors write those marketing papers and they say, well, if you don't buy our product, PCI Council will fine you. But guess what? PCI Council doesn't fine anybody. Brands do. And so when you read such materials, you only have to kind of like laugh nervously. This is our attempt to summarize the whole PCI into 6 domains and 12 requirements. So whenever people talk about PCI mandates you to blah, 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 they refer to one of the sections, and I would not dwell on this. I'm sure most of the people here have at least glanced over the standard. It's not that big, and it's not that complicated. In fact, I was talking to a merchant one day, and I told him, PCI is relatively simple, and I had this blank, hateful stare. But I said, well, have you tried reading some of the ISO documents, some of the NIST guidance, some of the other standards related to security, privacy, or any of the other stuff? And they're all significantly longer, and sometimes the language is messier. So PCI, in that sense, is simpler. Now, this is one of the things that I just have to stick in everybody's face, no matter what I'm talking about. If it's PCI, I just have to show the picture with the ceiling and the floor. Now, the funny part about the whole ceiling and floor is that no matter how many times people from the council, people from the security community, people from anywhere else talk about this, there will be a merchant, and you know what? by saying a merchant, I mean a whole crowd of merchants who would think of PCI as some kind of a unreasonable, lofty goal, some far-removed ceiling of security, which they would eventually, by the year 3000, hope to reach, and never would. So, despite this reality, PCI is meant as a floor. In fact, you can debate whether it's a floor or more of a sidewall of security, because it doesn't cover the whole security. But it's a useful reminder to everybody that it is meant by the original creators, well, not the creator, but the creators of the standard, to be the floor. At this point, we are ready to jump into the actual rights and wrongs.
Yeah, before we do that, though, how many in here are merchants, or representative merchants? A couple merchants, service providers. And I see some QSAs and vendors. Is that pretty much everybody else? And all you people that didn't raise your hand, do you know where you are? You know what we're talking about today? Everybody here? Okay. Go.
Perfect. So, this PCI in many minds of people is associated with whining. There's a lot of whining going on around PCI. And the most frequent reason to whine about PCI, sometimes people whine, sometimes they bitch and moan, they complain that PCI is just too hard. And for us here in this room, some people might be inclined to think that PCI is just this basic thing or it's very simple. In reality, for many companies, it does kind of upset them for being too complicated. Now, whining, though, is one of the very wrong things to do about PCI. You had a question?
Yeah.
Iona.
Yeah, I have a question. So do people complain that the standard is too hard or that proving compliance with it is too hard?
Standard is too hard. Proving compliance is hard. Doing things the right way is hard. And everything in the vicinity of the whole thing is just too darn hard.
It's not just one thing. It's kind of a catch-all.
Yeah,
We've heard a lot of different. I mean, the majority of it probably is that the standard is too hard to comply to, because their business isn't really set up. You know, they have to make business changes, or there's people that are resisting change in the business.
I was just curious.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Being compliant is something that feels like a minimum standard.
You're right.
But proving compliance to a payment card, the payment card industry, is an expense that is not necessarily easy for folks to justify to themselves.
Yep. Some cases, yep.
Yeah. So it's both of these and more. At the same time, when people confront through whatever it's called, 6 stages of grief, they confront that whining about PCI is just not very productive. They start whining about some select parts of PCI. And as you can guess, one of my favorite parts of PCI is logging and log management. And this is coincidentally a major source of whining when people say, well, okay, fine, we are doing it. But daily log reviews? And then the whining just restarts at high volume, because that is seen as one of the more onerous requirements. And guess what? The thing about this requirement is that it has something that you have to do frequently, more frequently than an assessment or self-assessment. So some people go as far as to say, well, yeah, you convinced us. We're going to do this PCI thing, but we're going to deal with the simple parts first. And then eventually, maybe when our friendly neighborhood QSA would compel us, then we'll do something to shut him up and deal with more complicated parts. And again, some areas that are in the DSS are kind of hard. Encryption key management are well-known hard problems. At the same time, logging and daily log review are up there as well. Still, whining rarely helps, and avoiding parts of PCI rarely helps with security, compliance, or in general with a bunch of other good things. And then Branden would talk much more about the compensating controls, one of the favorite concepts in PCI. But in many cases, when people stop complaining, they start saying, well, what are the ways to cheat our way out of PCI? And they start picking the controls which aren't in the standard and that don't fit anywhere near the requirement for compensating controls. And they're weak, and then the result is all wrong. Now, this line is typically used by the vendors who sell something. Try to benefit from PCI DSS. But you know what? Those vendors certainly are able to benefit from PCI DSS. But in this case, we are not talking about this. We are talking about a merchant or a service provider trying to use PCI for something good for them. And I call it the Dual Use Doctrine, kind of like the peaceful and military use for technology. This is where you'd have something, you might buy it for PCI, you might use compliance as a sledgehammer to get the budget, but then you dual use it for your purposes. And that's Actually, easier said than done, but it's doable. And I've seen many environments where technology is purchased under the